To obtain a permanent record of this form of weaving was indeed a worthwhile objective, a real challenge for us in behalf of the American Museum of Natural History, which is the repository of one of the finest collections of Tlingit baskets. Painstakingly produced, these baskets were often decorated with striking animal or geometrical designs. The coarser ones were used for a great many purposes, such as the gathering of berries, which grow in abundance in the summer, the storage of dried food, of household goods. Some were so finely twined that they could and did serve as water containers, and what may be hard for the uninitiated to believe, they were also used as cooking vessels. The Tlingit did not roam through the vast expanse of the Alaskan territory. Primarily, they inhabited the southeast coast, and the spruce baskets were not made beyond Cordova. Beside this village, some of the main weaving centers were Yakutat, Hoona, Juneau, Skagway, Sitka, Wrangell, down to Haida country, although it is believed that Yakutat, the canoe landing in the Tlingit language, was the birthplace of the weaving. We flew to Alaska in the late spring, hoping to record on film the entire process involved, although we were warned beforehand that we were probably too late, that the weavers who through generations had mastered this art were no longer likely to be found among the living. On the way, we stopped in Juneau, the present capital of Alaska, to gather as much information as possible. The city, nestled at the foot of the Rockies, is sheltered by islands and bays from the fury of the storms and high winds which generate in the Pacific. It is a small modern town clinging to the hillside, not a large metropolis. We see our first totem pole erected near the federal building, which also houses the Alaskan Museum, where many interesting Indian artifacts are carefully preserved. Totem poles were not mere expressions of an artist's imagination. They had a deep religious, historical, or social significance. Unfortunately, in the rainy climate of the coast, they did not weather well, and too few are preserved. Our search in Juneau did not shed any light on the possibility of finding any weaving activities in the adjacent region, and therefore we decided to proceed to Yakutat. On takeoff from Juneau Airport, we have a fine view of the Mendenhall Glacier a short distance away. In fair weather, the flight from Juneau to Yakutat is magnificent. The Rockies on the eastern side, snow-capped even in the summer, rise abruptly from the sea. They are deeply indented by bays and fjords, a breathtaking display of nature's beauty and might, still unspoiled by the activities of mankind. Although the coastline has been extensively traveled through the ages by the Tlingit, who were great sailors, and more recently by explorers, traders, and prospectors, the hinterland, with its masses of forbidding peaks, eternally covered with snow and ice, has even to this day defied human intrusion, except from the air. No one has crossed or set foot on the range we are now viewing. It is an impenetrable fortress with hundreds of lofty peaks as bastions. This is still virgin land, untrodden, unexplored by human beings. We are now approaching our destination, the village of Yakutat, sheltered in a cove on the southwest shore of the bay of the same name, the home of a few hundred Tlingit who for their livelihood depend primarily on commercial salmon fishing during the short summer season. Towering over the bay from almost any vantage point, some 80 miles distant, Mount St. Elias, 18,008 feet above sea level, the third highest peak in North America. Today, the dwelling of the Indians of Yakutat are mostly unpretentious, small, drab, unpainted wooden buildings, many still without electricity and also without plumbing, often a single stove serving the dual purpose of heating and cooking. Household goods are stored whenever they can be most conveniently located, often right on the porch if there is one. As it rains a great deal in Yakutat, the rain barrel is still a familiar sight. It saves the trouble of pumping water from a nearby well, and the rain beat on the roof is often welcome music during dry spells. Whenever the rain stops and the sun comes out, so does the wash, and gay festoons of multicolored garments strung on clotheslines decorate the yards of each household. The cannery and docks built to accommodate the very high local tides lend a more modern touch to the village. Unfortunately, salmon fishing has not been very good in the nearby rivers, and the cannery has been idled for several years. On clear days in the spring and summer, the sun sets almost directly behind Mount St. Elias. This led the Tlingit of old to believe that this imposing peak was the throne or the bed of the mighty sun god. The children of Yakutat today live in relative comfort, play with modern toys, and receive an excellent primary education in the public school of the village. Many do not speak Tlingit, the language of their elders, which therefore will probably be completely forgotten in a fairly short span of years. Hardy Trefzger, a true Alaskan sourdough, made this film possible. Over the years, he painstakingly acquired a remarkable collection of baskets, probably the finest privately owned one. It is now on loan to the Seattle Museum. Landing in Yakutat in 1914, he witnessed the rapid transition of the former way of life of the Indians to the pattern of today. By his kindliness, his sincere interest, and his complete trustworthiness, he quickly earned the respect and friendship of the natives. Keenly interested in the welfare of the Tlingit whom he served as U.S. Commissioner, he also learned and mastered their difficult language and became a student of their traditions, their history, and their arts. As glass bottles were sources of wonder for earlier generations of Tlingit, they were greatly prized and often covered with the finest weaves and designs. This is part of his collection in Seattle. No longer are baskets to be found in the homes of the Tlingit in the north. Hardy started our quest as soon as we landed in Yakutat, calling on all his old friends. in the hope of finding among the living one still able to show us the many intricate steps required for the weaving of baskets. Yes, the aged ones remembered, but they did not know whether any old Indian weaver was still alive or well enough to help us out. We spent several days asking the same question over and over again. Do you remember the old spruce baskets woven by all the Indian women in olden days? Is there still one living in the village, or where could we find one? Some did remember, but none of the younger generations even knew what spruce baskets were. Everywhere, Hardy received a hearty welcome. His old friends were indeed glad to see him back, but alas, they could not help us. We had photographs of baskets with us, and we showed them at every occasion, especially to the older Tlingit women, who were presumably the only ones who might remember and help us. Days and days went by, and we gradually became more and more discouraged. Nevertheless, we continued our inquiries, and in so doing, we must have knocked at practically every door in the village and the surrounding area. However, finally, we received some encouragement. Sarah, herself a fan embroiderer, told us that her relative, elderly Annie George, just returned from the Juneau hospital and still confined to her home, had again started to work on a basket she had begun 2 years before, which she had intended to present as a gift to a visiting missionary. Indeed, we found her at her home, dexterously weaving a lovely, small, cylindrical basket, almost completed. Were we going to be successful after all? At last, we had found a weaver. At first, although somewhat reluctantly, she was willing enough to help us in our undertaking. And we made all arrangements, or rather, Hardy did, as she spoke little English. But the following day, her attitude had changed completely. Under no circumstances, or at any price, would she show us how baskets were made. And she would not give us any reason. No movie of the baskets, no pictures. Word had been passed around the village that we should not be allowed to take records of the weaving. It would be a great shame for the nation to unveil this precious art to the white men, even though Hardy was a trusted friend. Would this sequence be the only one we would bring back as a result of all our planning of many months and our long trip from New York? All over again, we had to start our quest through the village, although by that time we had become greatly discouraged and had little hope of success. Our previous inquiries had led us to believe that we'd be even less successful in other villages, also former weaving centers. But at last, luck smiled on us when Hardy knocked at the door of Annie Johnson, great-grandmother Annie, who had just returned to Yakutat from farther south. Make a basket? Me? Why, yes, of course I remember. My mother taught me when I was 6 years old, but I haven't made one in over 20 years. Still, Hardy, you saved my child a long time ago, and if I can, I will be glad to help you. So, with the help of her much younger husband, George, who spoke some English, we arranged a trip to nearby Kantak Island to record the first step of the weaving, the gathering of the roots. We rushed, fearing that Annie George might also yield to the pressure of the voices of the village and change her mind. Yet, we did not know until much later on how much agitation our search had created. On the surface, everyone was friendly, but nevertheless strong opposition was voiced by some natives. However, we were fortunate to have on our side also many friendly Indians who felt that we were trying to accomplish a worthwhile undertaking. Still, Annie showed great courage and determination as threats had been made. A wooden house could be quickly consumed by fire in the middle of the night. Assisted by her great-grandson, Annie, bent by the years, manages the slippery rocks leading from the foot of her house down to the bay where her husband, George, is waiting with his fishing dory. Slowly, carefully, she comes down the steep incline and steps up into the boat. As we leave Yakutat, many memories of her youth come back to Annie's mind. Kantak Island, until the turn of the century, the site of the former village of Yakutat, had been selected for a specific reason. The spruce trees of the mainland, growing among rocks and boulders, did not produce the proper roots, whereas the trees growing on the low, sandy island a few miles offshore, if the trees of the right size were selected, would yield the tough, resilient, uniform, long roots called heart needed for the weaving. These are gathered preferably in the spring. Kantak, the sacred island where Annie has spent her youth and where ghosts of the older generations roam at night. To this day, many Indians refuse to visit the ruins of the former village or especially go near the old overgrown cemetery. As we reach the grove, Annie carefully selects the right tree. And here, with her bare hands, she starts to dig the roots, buried only a few inches in the loose, sandy soil. Mature trees, about a foot or two in diameter, called shy key, with a reddish bark, are most desirable. They produce a root with greater pliability, better color, more uniform texture, and with greater length, free of side shoots and roughness. In the olden days, the entire process from the first selection of material to the finished product was woman's work. But here we see kindly George give a helping hand to his much older wife. The tedious gathering of the roots takes many hours of careful digging. They are amazingly uniform in diameter over great length, and they reach 30, 40, 50 feet from the trunk of the trees. Annie then carefully cleans and ties each strip into a bundle. The roots are full of sap, and Annie protects her bundles as soon as they are gathered from the sun and from the wind, which would dry them out. The second step, and a most important one in the preparation of the raw material, is the stripping of the bark from the root, a delicate operation, although a simple one. Preferably, the same day they are gathered, the bundles of roots are slightly roasted, one by one, over a small, smoky fire. While still hot, they are uncoiled and pulled through a stick firmly bedded in the ground with a V-shaped notch at the top called an ina. Actually, the bark is steamed and is thus readily separated from the root itself. A long, smooth, shiny round fiber, pale yellow in color, very supple and of great strength. Considerable experience is required to do a perfect job, as too little pressure or heat would leave the bark adhering in patches, and too much pressure would remove the prized shiny outer luster. Too long exposure to the fire would scorch the fiber and turn it brown and brittle. Having processed all her roots, Annie once more ties them in 2 bundles. While all this work was going on, her great-grandson, who had accompanied us, did what young boys have done from time immemorial. He went scouting for birds and nests and came back very happy with a young crow. It is getting late in the day and Annie is tired, although she has greatly enjoyed the work she has done. As we leave, we are compelled to take a last look at the scenery surrounding Kantak, unforgettable in its splendor. Back at home, Annie kept the roots immersed in water for several days to make them even more pliable and ready for the next step, the splitting of the roots, another delicate operation requiring great care and skill. The root is not simply divided in halves or quarters, but in 5 parallel layers. The outer layers are rounded on the surface by the circular shape of the root. These are the 2 prized fibers used for the weft strand of the weave, the outside of the basket. The flat second layers are used for the warp, the inner surface of the basket and the bottom. The center layer of the root, which contains the heart or pith, is of no value and is discarded. The uniformity of the diameter of the roots over great length ensures a remarkable evenness in the fibers and in the resulting weaves. After making a carefully gauged incision, Annie follows the standard practice of holding the roots between her teeth. And with the nail of her right thumb, she forces the split farther down the length of the entire root, while the strand is kept taut with her left hand. The root, which often spirals upon itself, is gradually straightened out. Dry, the root will splinter or not split evenly. Happy over the progress she is making, Annie once again ties her fibers into bundles. A skillful weaver and embroiderer, she looks forward to her weaving, which she has not practiced in many years. Yes, pleasant memories. Annie is not yet ready to start her basket. Every bundle has to be gone over carefully. The irregularities smoothed out, the warp strands scraped and flattened to a uniform thickness. For this purpose, she uses a perfect, if primitive, tool, the shell of a blue mussel called a yeeze, the broad end of which has been ground and honed down to a sharp edge. According to taboo, the shell must have been taken from under the water, and the sun must not have been watching when it was gathered, or else bad luck will befall the weavers. The weft and warp strands are now fully prepared, and at last Annie is ready to start weaving her basket. Between weaving sessions, the material is kept moist in a damp cloth and in a cool, dark place. But even during the weaving, a bowl of water is always kept at hand, and you must dip her fingers in it often to keep the fibers soft and pliable. We are now ready for another important step, the gathering, the preparation and the dyeing of special grasses needed for the embroidering of the design on the outside of the basket. Actually, it is a false embroidery. The grass stems are wrapped around the weft strands so that the pattern shows only on the outside of the basket. It is technically called imbrication. In early days, many dyes were used, such as blacks, reds, orange, yellows, and blue-greens in varying shades and hues. One was made of the bark of alders, which grows near sea level. George gathered this material using his faithful axe to strip it from the tree growing near the beach. Meanwhile, Annie had picked the stalks of the special grasses to be dyed. Of course, in later years, commercial dyes were used. George brings back a basket full of alder bark. And Annie breaks the larger piece of bark into smaller pieces, which will be boiled in water. In years gone by, the Indians did not have iron kettles, and for this purpose, they probably used skin bags or old baskets buried in hot sand. The dye used varied greatly. Each tribe, or even each weaver, had its own preferences, or had to use what was available in the district. Here, for instance, blueberries are used. They produced a purplish black, kut klar. The urine of children was an important element needed to set many dyes in the grass fibers. This ingredient was used not only by the Tlingit, but also by many primitive peoples throughout the world. The grasses, cut to suitable length and tied in bundles, are now dipped in the boiling dyeing solution until the proper shade is reached. Then they are removed and dried, although unfortunately even then many faded with time. The young crow welcomes our return to Annie's house, and for the obvious reason that he is always ravenously hungry. In the days following, Annie resumes her weaving, always keeping her material wrapped in a damp cloth away from the heat when not being worked upon. In olden days, while weaving, the weaver always sat on the ground with her knees drawn up to her chin and with her arms around her knees in a cramped position. Working off and on, a weaver might take from 2 to 6 months to finish a medium size or a large basket. No wonder they were prized possessions. While all baskets were begun in the same manner, 5 different weaves were produced. The weaver had to know how to turn up the bottoms, to start the sides, to add or remove splints to obtain the shape desired, to add the dyed grasses to produce the decoration, and to finish the borders without loss of strength. Small wonder such tedious work done in the past rapidly lost flavor with the Tlingit once they were able to obtain metal, glass, or pottery vessels, wooden or cardboard boxes in which to keep their household goods and winter provisions. The general store obviates the necessity of gathering and storing the food required to sustain the family during the long white month of the winter. But for centuries past, the weaving of spruce roots was not restricted to the making of baskets, even though these varied greatly in size, from small amulets hung by a string around the neck to huge, flat, berry-gathering plaques and large storage containers. Nets for fishing, ropes, and cradles for the babies, shamans or chief's hats were also woven of the spruce root fiber. Annie had to interrupt her weaving for days on end due to painful rheumatiz, and it took a long time to finish the basket which had been promised. But here they are, not the finest nor the most ornate, but the prized expression of the given promise of the kept word. Will these few baskets be among the last ever to be made by the northwest coastal Indians? So little of their ethnological background is still to be found in the homes of the Indians. 7 yearly visits to Yakutat had produced so little. A graceful spoon carved not of wood, but of mountain sheep horn, and adze with a precious blade of iron used to hollow out canoes, a halibut fish hook made of wood, a seal oil lamp from the north with a sea otter design. Traditions, the art of the past, are only dim lights in the lives of the younger Tlingit. Well, we have seen how for centuries the baskets were made. Shall we now try to illustrate a few of the uses for which they were intended? Here is Annie drying and sorting the kelp, the seaweed gathered at low tide by her relatives, edible kelps, the dulse of Nova Scotia, which, either black or brown, has a delicate flavor almost akin to mushrooms, which is gathered in summer and stored for winter use. A young Tlingit urchin is sampling in the raw stage this vegetable rich in iodine, grown in the Pacific Ocean. The spring, summer, and early fall were busy times for the Tlingit. The crops had to be gathered, the harvest made, even though they did not grow any grain or vegetables, nor did they have domesticated animals except their watchdogs. But nature is a good provider on the Pacific coast, and an abundance of seals, fish, clams, eggs, birds, berries, and edible plants could be hunted or fished or gathered by all the members of a family. In this rainy climate, wild celery grows to enormous size, and stripped of its outer cover and of the terminal leaves, the stems are good to eat raw or cooked. George is bringing in a basketful of the first crop to Annie, who enjoys the treat. Of the 2 varieties found locally, only one is edible, and even then only for a short period in the spring. The area surrounding Yakutat has changed but little in recent years. The Indians still share the unspoiled wilderness with wildlife. 2 young cow moose are spotted in a bay, grazing the first shoots of grass. The greens are a pleasant change from the bark and twigs and branches of bushes which are their meager fare during the winter months when the ground is covered with a deep blanket of snow. A big black bear, out of hibernation, is also enjoying a fine meal of buds and green shoots of the bushes which grow rapidly as soon as the first signs of spring and warmth appear, even though a lot of snow remains on the ground. Disturbed by us, he reluctantly leaves his dinner table, undoubtedly disgruntled by our intrusion in his territory. Beautiful wild region, teeming with salmon and seals, the land of the Tlingit, the haunts of huge brownies, of blacks, and of the extremely rare blue or glacier bear. Halibut and salmon fishing was an art mastered long ago by the Tlingit, even though they used only primitive wooden hooks and nets made again of the resilient roots of the spruce trees. Of course, today modern dories powered by outboard and commercial nets make the task much easier. The salmon, cut in long strips, were first pickled in brine, then lightly smoked and finally air-dried for storage in baskets. The same process is still used today, and the salmon thus preserved keeps for a long time. Finely woven baskets called kuk-tu-kahi were also used to cook food by a primitive method. Yes, this was a routine procedure for the Indians. First, a fire is built, and as Ari does here, small flat stones are thrown into the glowing embers. In the meantime, George digs a hole in the sand. The food, meat, fish, or fowl, in this instance a cut of king salmon, is deposited in the basket, which Annie then lowers into the hole. She now carefully fills the space surrounding the basket. And George, armed with wooden tongs, places a few heated stones on top of the fish. Annie then adds some seawater scooped up in a clam shell. More stones are added. Again some water. And then the basket and its content are covered carefully with a sealskin. After a surprisingly short period of time, which may vary from a few minutes for fish to an hour or more for such delicacies as moose or caribou feet, the skin is removed. And the food, thoroughly cooked, is ready to be enjoyed by our two friends, right on a nearby log. Undoubtedly, in the past, many a meal has been cooked from this lovely vantage point on Kantak Island by the same simple method which had been used by other races since prehistoric times. Different users required different basket shapes and types of weaves, as they were primarily utilitarians. Some were tiny, like the snuff box, tuktahkate, or the saltwater drinking cup, ki shayut ki, and other truly huge, like the 25-gallon oil storage baskets. Some were large flat discs, the berry screening plaques, kudutzayate, other cylindrical, called yarduk shark, which were used as strainers to render fish and seal oil. We have here Harvey Milton, head of one of the freightaries of Yakutat, returning from a visit to the nest of the chickens of the Indians, the graceful seagulls of the coast, which in the spring congregate in large colonies among the cliffs and sheer walls of some of the islands of the section. These surprisingly large mottled eggs, first collected in the shirt of the Indian who needs both hands for hold among the rocks, are then deposited in large flat baskets on a bed of moss, thus lessening the danger of breakage. Hard-boiled, these eggs are quite tasty and keep a long time. And here we have Annie and her family enjoying this nourishing food. Raw or not cooked thoroughly, the yolks are very fishy in flavor, which is not surprising considering the diet of the seagull. But scenes of this kind are rapidly becoming things of the past. The youngsters of today will probably know little of the way of life of their forebears, unless all the ethnological and historical data are already accumulated, and the tradition and skills of the Tlingits are carefully recorded and preserved for them. How many will learn to speak their tongue? Why spend months weaving baskets when big tubs can be bought for a few dollars at the general store along with other kinds of canned food, and riding bicycles is more fun than gathering berries or fishing seal for their skin and their oil? Yet the Tlingits still have a deep artistic sense, possibly bred into them through untold generations. For instance, our old friend Annie, as well as many other Indian women, loves to embroider with beads and patches of colorful material, striking designs on moccasins sold to tourists, or to spend countless days decorating in the same fashion flamboyant ceremonial costumes used during dancing festivities which are being revived. While the way of life of the Tlingit has undergone many changes over a short span of years, nevertheless the scenery surrounding Yakutat is still unchanged. Nature continues to express its might as it did in the past in a forceful, often awe-inspiring way. Only 30-odd miles away from Yakutat, in this Enchantment Bay, huge glaciers with walls several hundred feet high rising from the sea, such as the Hubbard, Turner, and Hankey glaciers, break up into the bay with thunder-like rumblings. The resultant field of ice flows shift with the swift tidal currents, either filling the bay, piling up ashore, drifting into the open seas. To the Tlingit of the past, only living gods could have gathered such powers. And no wonder that so many amazing legends born from these manifestations of nature are to a degree still believed by the modern Tlingit. Conflicts of nature's forces, conflict between the gods who must be placated by man. And this may explain why almost every tool or weapon was elaborately carved or decorated. How fortunate indeed that this vanishing culture and art, to an extent at least while it was still possible, have been painstakingly collected and recorded by dedicated scientists working for a few institutions such as the American Museum of Natural History of New York. Otherwise, these lovely baskets with their original designs and shapes no doubt would have been lost by this time. They are, of course, only a fragment of the peculiar yet forceful art developed through centuries by the Tlingit, who excelled in other forms of artistic expressions, such as wood carvings, paintings, and weaving as in Chilkat blankets, in spite of the limitations of their primitive tools. The Tlingit excelled in woodworking, in carving mask boxes, totem poles, rattles used by their shamans to ward off evil spirits and propitiate the favorable gods of nature. Striking of design and color, these are bold, artistic expression of this practically extinct and unique culture. May no wanton war or disaster ever destroy the priceless collections and scientific data gathered, the result of painstaking research to which so many scientists have dedicated themselves. And so, another pebble of knowledge has been added to the vast treasures of the American Museum of Natural History for the benefit of present and future generations of Americans.